Hill 213, west of Tunis, the spring of 1943. A German tank commander rides high in the cupola of his Panzer, hatch open, eyes sweeping a low ridge of scrub and rock. His machine weighs over 20 tons. The armor across its front is thick enough to shrug off the anti-tank rifles the infantry used to fear. He has done this 100 times. The road ahead looks empty. Then a streak of fire crosses the gap. Not the flat crack of a cannon, something slower, trailing smoke, almost lazy-looking. It strikes the side of the hull with a sound he has never heard before, a hard metallic snap, like a hammer driven through a tin roof. Inside, one of his crew screams. He never saw the man who fired it. There was no gun emplacement, no tank, no artillery flash on the horizon. Just a single soldier lying in the rocks with a metal tube on his shoulder, a tube that weighed about as much as a loaded toolbox. And in that moment, the commander did the only thing a sane man could do. He dropped into the hull, slammed the hatch, and ordered the driver to reverse out of the killing ground. That order, repeated across 1,000 hedgerows and 1,000 ridgelines, is the whole story. A foot soldier with a 13-pound tube made a 20-ton machine turn and run. This is not a story about a tube that killed tanks. It is a forensic audit of fear. Why a single foot soldier with a shaped charge made 40-ton crews button up, break off, and abandon machines they could not see being hit. And why the enemy paid that weapon the highest compliment there is. Because here is the part that matters. The German crews who met the American Bazooka did not laugh it off. They captured it. They studied it. And within a year, they built their own, bigger version. And they gave it a name that tells you exactly how they felt about it. They called it the Panzerschreck. Tank terror. To understand why grown men in armored vehicles came to dread a piece of pipe, you have to go back to a firing range in Maryland and a sight made out of a coat hanger. It is May of 1942. The United States Army has a problem it has not solved. The same problem every army has wrestled with since the tank first crawled across a battlefield. How do you give one ordinary infantryman the power to kill an armored vehicle? Not a gun crew. Not a towed cannon that takes 6 men and a truck. One man, lying in the dirt, with something he can carry. For years the answer was the anti-tank rifle, a long, heavy gun that fired a solid slug and prayed it would punch through. By 1942, those rifles were already useless against modern armor. They bounced. The infantry knew it, and so did the tank crews, who learned they could drive straight at a rifleman with very little to fear. 2 men were about to change that math. The first was Captain Leslie Skinner, an army officer who had spent the lean interwar years quietly obsessed with rockets when almost nobody in the army cared about them. Through the 1920s and 30s, while the rest of the service starved his work of money and attention, Skinner kept tinkering, certain that a rocket fired from a man's shoulder could one day matter. The second man was a young lieutenant named Edward Ohl, who had just joined Skinner's small projects unit. By the spring of 1942, Skinner already had the warhead. The army had handed him a small shaped charge grenade, the M10, a fist-sized charge that could already punch through tank armor on contact. The trouble was that the M10 was too heavy to throw and too clumsy to fire from a rifle with any reach. Skinner had a thing that could kill a tank. What he did not have was a way for a soldier to launch it from the shoulder, across a useful distance, without burning his own hands off in the rocket exhaust. Ohl found the answer by accident. He was walking past a scrap pile and spotted a length of tube, and the idea landed all at once. Put the rocket inside the tube, let the tube guide it, and shield the man from the backblast. He cut the pipe, fitted a crude grip, and wired up a firing system using 2 ordinary flashlight batteries, so that pulling the trigger sent a spark down the tube and lit the rocket motor. He built a set of launch tubes, loaded a dozen practice rockets, and proved the thing worked. It was almost embarrassingly simple. A tube, a rocket, 2 dry cell batteries, 2 wires, and a man. Then came the test that decided everything. In May of 1942, Skinner and Ohl brought their contraption to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The army was running a competitive trial that day, lining up several different anti-tank weapons against a moving target. A tank was driving back and forth across the range, and one after another, the weapons were given their chance to hit it. Several spigot mortars fired. Every one of them missed. Not one could put a round on the moving tank. Then the two men with the pipe took their turn. And here is the detail that nobody believes the first time they hear it. The two men had realized that very morning that their launcher had no sights at all. So they bent one into shape on the spot, fashioned out of a wire coat hanger by hand, because they had not had time to build a proper one. With that coat hanger sight, they hit the moving tank. Then they hit it again. It was the only weapon on the range that day that could touch a target in motion. Generals do not usually make decisions standing on a firing range. That day, one did. Senior officers and ordnance men watched the two hits land, and the weapon was pushed straight to the top of the army. General George Marshall, the most senior officer in the United States Army, gave the order, and the Army called for about 5,000 of them at once. The production contract went out to General Electric in Bridgeport, Connecticut, on the 20th of May, and the company was given a brutal deadline of just 30 days to turn the prototype into a deliverable weapon. The official name was the 2.36-inch rocket launcher M1. The soldiers, who thought the fat tube looked like a goofy musical instrument from a radio comedy, called it the Bazooka. The name stuck so hard that the official designation never had a chance. By the 14th of June, 1942, it was an issued weapon, from a coat hanger to the front line in a matter of weeks. But a launcher is just a pipe. The thing that made the bazooka dangerous was what came out of the front of it, and that is where the real engineering lived. Here is the trick. The bazooka rocket left the tube slowly. We are talking about a muzzle speed of only around 265 feet per second. A rifle bullet travels 10 times faster than that. By the logic of every gun ever built, a projectile that's slow should bounce off armor like a thrown rock. So how did it punch through 3 inches of steel? The answer is a shaped charge, and the science behind it was already more than 50 years old when the bazooka fired its first shot. Back in the 1880s, an American chemist named Charles Munroe was working at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, when he noticed something strange. When he detonated a block of explosive that had letters stamped into its surface, the blast cut those very letters into the steel plate behind it. The hollow shapes focused the explosion. Munroe pushed the idea further and found that carving a cone-shaped cavity into the face of a charge drove it far deeper into a steel target than a solid block of the same explosive. The hollow did the work. That focusing of a blast by an empty cavity is still called the Munroe effect today, and it is the entire secret of the bazooka. The warhead, called the M6, did not rely on speed or weight to break armor. It relied on that geometry. Inside the nose was a cone of copper lining a charge of explosive, with an empty space ahead of it. When the rocket struck the tank, the explosive detonated from the back and slammed that copper cone inward on itself. Under pressure measured in the millions of pounds, the metal stopped behaving like a solid and flowed like a liquid. It squeezed into a thin, blazing jet of copper and shot forward, focused onto a spot of armor smaller than a coin. That jet moves at a speed measured in thousands of miles per hour, many times faster than the rocket that delivered it. This is why the empty space in the nose mattered, and why the rocket was built to detonate at the right distance from the plate. The jet needs a short run of open air, the standoff distance, to stretch out and gather its full speed before it bites into the steel. Too close, and the jet has not formed. Set right, it arrives as a needle of molten copper moving faster than any bullet. And here is the key to the whole audit. The jet does not defeat armor by hitting it hard. It is not kinetic energy, not mass times speed, the way a cannon shell works. It defeats armor by sheer focused pressure, boring a narrow channel through the steel the way a stream of water cuts through sand. That jet bores its channel straight through the plate, and what follows it into the crew compartment is a spray of molten metal and overpressure into a sealed box full of men, fuel, and ammunition. This is why the slow, lazy-looking rocket worked. The speed that mattered was never the speed you could see. It was the speed of the jet, born at the moment of contact. For the first time, one man lying in the dirt could carry the power to gut a tank. No truck, no gun crew, no towing cannon, a 13-pound tube and a rocket the length of your forearm. Now, the bazooka was not magic. And this is where an honest audit has to slow down, because the truth here makes the fear more impressive, not less. The first time the weapon went to war, it nearly fell flat. Its combat debut came during Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa in November of 1942. It did not go well. The early M6 rockets were unreliable. Worse, many of the troops carrying them had never been trained to use them. The story goes that on the eve of the landings, the senior American commander was stunned to learn that his men had received no instruction on the new weapon at all. So, in North Africa, the bazooka did very little. It arrived faster than the knowledge of how to use it. The weapon itself kept improving, even as the crews learned. The first M1 was refined into the M1A1, with a sturdier tube and a better firing setup. Then came the bigger redesign, the M9 and the M9A1, which solved a problem the paratroopers had complained about loudly. The early tube was a single fixed length over 4 feet long, an awkward thing to jump out of an aircraft with strapped to your body. The M9 broke the tube into 2 pieces that screwed apart, cutting the carrying length nearly in half so a man could pack it for a drop and assemble it on the ground. It also swapped the cold-prone battery ignition for a small magneto generator built into the trigger, so a hard pull made its own spark, and the weapon fired reliably in winter. A later, far more powerful 3.5-inch version, the so-called Super Bazooka, would come after this war, built on everything learned here. But the weapon that fought this war, in every theatre, stayed the 2.36-inch. And even once the crews learned their trade, the bazooka had a hard ceiling. As the war went on, the German tanks got bigger and their armour got thicker. Against the front of a Panther or a Tiger, the early bazooka was simply not enough. That 3 inches of penetration met 5 or 6 inches of sloped frontal plate, and the jet did not get through. So the bazooka teams adapted. And the way they adapted is the whole reason the tank crews lived in dread. They stopped aiming at the front. A bazooka man learned to ignore the thick glacis plate entirely and wait. He aimed for the side, where the armour was thinner. He aimed for the rear, where the engine and the fuel lived. He aimed for the tracks and the suspension to break the machine and leave it stranded. He aimed for the vision ports, the thin slits the crew saw the world through. He hid in a hedgerow or a ditch or a pile of rubble, and he let the tank come to him, and then he fired into the part the designers had hoped nobody could reach. Nowhere did this matter more than in Normandy in the summer of 1944. The country behind the invasion beaches was the bocage, a maze of small fields walled in by earth banks and dense hedgerows centuries old, where a tank often could not see more than a few dozen yards in any direction. It was perfect bazooka ground. A team could lie behind a hedge bank at 20 or 30 yards, a range so close the rocket could hardly miss, and fire into the flank or the tracks of a tank that had no idea they were there. The numbers tell the story. Between late June and late July of 1944, American infantry in Normandy fired close to 53,000 bazooka rockets, most of them not even at tanks but at machine gun nests, dug-in positions, and farmhouse strongpoints, because the shaped charge gutted those too. The weapon was valued so highly in the hedgerows that rifle companies pulled bazookas away from rear units to put more of them on the front line. And this is the detail that explains the fear better than any kill count. A tank crew can fight a gun they can see. They can shoot back at an anti-tank cannon. They can charge it. But how do you fight a man you cannot find, who is lying in the weeds 20 or 30 yards away, who needs exactly one good shot at your flank, and who can pull the trigger before you ever know he is there? You cannot. So you do the only thing left. You button up, you close every hatch, and fight half-blind through those narrow vision slits. You slow down. You stop pushing into close country where the tubes might be hiding. And, very often, you back out entirely. This is the part the kill statistics miss. A great deal of what the bazooka actually did was not measured in burning tanks. It was measured in tanks that were abandoned by their crews, or pulled back, or never sent forward into a town or a wood in the first place, because of what might be waiting there. The weapon did not have to destroy the machine. It only had to convince the men inside that staying was suicide. A tank that buttons up has half the eyes it had a moment before. A tank that withdraws is a tank that is not winning ground, and it withdrew because of a man with a pipe. So picture it from inside the turret. You command a machine that cost a fortune and took a factory full of skilled workers to build, and your life can be ended by a soldier holding 13 pounds of stamped metal, a man so cheap to equip that an army can hand a tube to almost anyone. That imbalance, the fortune against the pipe, is exactly the kind of thing that gets under a crew's skin and stays there. We know it got under their skin because of what they did next. In November of 1942, during the fighting in Tunisia, German forces captured intact American bazookas on the battlefield, and their response tells you everything about how seriously they took the weapon. They did not dismiss it as a toy. They crated the captured tubes up, shipped them home, and handed them to their own engineers with a simple instruction: build this, make it bigger. The Germans did exactly that, and they were good at it. They took the American idea, the tube, the shaped charge, the shoulder launch, and they scaled it up. The American rocket was 2.36 inches across. The German version was 88 millimeters, noticeably fatter, with a heavier rocket and a bigger warhead that could bite far deeper into armor than the bazooka ever could. The 88 here is the bore of the rocket, the proper name of the weapon, not to be confused with the famous towed anti-tank gun of the same caliber. The official designation was a mouthful: the Raketenpanzerbuchse, the rocket tank rifle, the Model 54. That bigger rocket came with a price the Germans had to engineer around. Its larger motor threw a far heavier wash of flame and smoke back at the firer than the American tube did, enough to scorch a man's face and hands. So in February of 1944, the Germans bolted a small square blast shield with a window onto the launcher, so the gunner could fire from behind it without being burned. The shield added weight, pushing the empty launcher to around 24 pounds, but it let a man fight the weapon without flinching. The Germans were not alone in chasing the same idea, either. Alongside it, they fielded a smaller, cheaper answer to the very same problem: the Panzerfaust, a one-shot disposable tube a single soldier could fire once and throw away, built in enormous numbers so that nearly any man could carry tank-killing power for an afternoon. But the launcher they copied straight from the bazooka, the reusable shoulder tube, carried a nickname, and that nickname is the entire point of this video. The troops called it the Panzerschreck, tank terror. Sit with that for a second. An army does not name a weapon after a feeling unless the feeling is the weapon. They did not call it the tank killer or the tank breaker. They named it after the dread it was built to produce, the same dread their own crews had felt, staring at an empty ridge in Tunisia, waiting for a streak of smoke they would never see coming. The German copy reached the troops in the spring of 1944, and in the hedgerows of Normandy the wheel came full circle. Now it was American and British tank crews learning to fear the smoke trail from the bushes. The Panzerschreck crews set their ambushes along the same wooded lanes of that bocage country and made the Allied tankers pay the same toll the Germans had paid, the same toll the whole weapon was designed to collect. Fear, traded back and forth, from a tube that started life as a length of scrap pipe and a coat hanger on a range in Maryland. And that is the deeper finding of this audit. The bazooka did not just kill some tanks, it changed the shape of the battlefield itself. Before it, killing a tank was the job of a gun crew, a cannon, a team, and a truck. After it, the job belonged to one man in the dirt. And within 2 years of that coat hanger trial, both sides had rebuilt their infantry around the idea. The American with his bazooka, the German with his Panzerschreck and his Panzerfaust. The whole balance between foot soldier and armor tilted, permanently, because of a tube. Every shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket carried by an infantryman since traces straight back to that range in Maryland. So let us close the audit and put the finding plainly. If you measure the bazooka only by tanks it physically destroyed, you will undersell it, and you will miss the whole story. The early warhead could not crack the front of the heaviest German armor, and its combat debut was a near fumble. Those are the honest limits, and they matter. But the record shows something the kill count cannot. It shows tank commanders slamming hatches and reversing out of ground they could no longer hold. It shows machines worth a fortune backing away from a soldier worth a tube. And it shows the most damning evidence of all, the kind no statistic can argue with. The enemy met this weapon, and instead of laughing, they copied it. They built their own, made it bigger, and named it after the exact emotion it produced. That is the verdict. You do not name a weapon tank terror unless the terror is real. The German crews who fought the bazooka did not just respect it. They feared it enough to recreate the fear and aim it back the other way. A 13-pound tube, born from a scrap pile and a coat hanger, frightened the crews of the most powerful machines on the battlefield so badly that they paid it the one compliment no slogan can fake. They built it themselves.